Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Notes from the Aleph. And Aleph is a high point from which all things are visible, and from a vantage point, we'll be looking at tabletop role-playing games, their design, and the theory behind those design. Here, our motto is to be fair, build up, and have fun. I'm your host, GriffinVarro, joined by our editor of Theta, our local designer, Norman Rafferty, and our good friends and GMs, RedRabbit and Lessons Learned. When it comes to tabletop role-playing games, I have 15 years' experience running, playing, and frequently fixing problematic rules at the table. Pronouns are he, him, they, them. Lessons, why don't you go next?
Yes, I am Lessons Learned on YouTube, Lessons Learned here on Twitch. I run the Mirror Soul Shadowrun game on Sundays, and I'm also a budding game designer as well as a writer over at Amazon on Night and Stars. My pronouns are he, him, they, them is fine as well. And I love to just badger people with my silly questions about role-playing games.
And of course, one of our up-and-coming newest, youngest game developers, Rafferty, why don't you introduce yourself?
There's a joke I'll tell later. Hello, world. I'm Norman Rafferty, he, him. I work for Sanguine Games, where I've been making games for years. I'm angry at make-believe.
Hooray. And Red, what about you?
I'm RedRabbit. I'm running our Iron Claw game Wednesday mornings. I'm also running games in Vampire and currently a Powered by the Apocalypse game called Monster Care Squad. And my favorite nonsensical genre is Weird West, which is like West but with robots and aliens and demons.
Well, I like all of those things.
There you go.
All right. So, for today, as we've stated on the show before, rules endorse behavior, and sometimes that behavior that you want to express are the cliches of genre. You might want an action set piece where you have characters diving for cover, throwing back grenades, or hanging onto the sides of moving vehicles for your action. Or perhaps you want mystery, interrogation, character connections for your mystery type of stories. So today, we'll be talking about all those kind of things that you can do to show off what genre is in your game. So we're talking about ludonarrative harmony. There you go. Now there's a $10 word right there. I think most of us here are familiar with that word, right?
Yeah. Well, more so with ludonarrative dissonance, right? The opposite of this, but yes.
Right, the opposite of it is ludonarrative dissonance, where you have a game that says one thing and has you doing another, where it says, oh, you must protect people and have pacifism in your soul, and then it gives you a gun and has you shoot 3 people in a row, and gives you 10 points for headshots.
Yeah.
So the opposite is when those two things are in cohesion, where the game says, you are a cold-blooded killer, and we give you more money for being a clean killer, and you get 10 points for headshots.
Well,
that's where it's in harmony.
Well, I could take this one step further, because often if the game is incredibly linear, you can get, I've talked about Rosencrantz-style role-playing, which is nothing we do actually matters. So we're only here to entertain ourselves. And so if the plot line, like this is what was cracking me up about the Tyrant Queen adventure in D&D, because the people come by and ask us, we need your help. The dragon armies are encroaching. And in our party, everyone was neutral or evil. So it's like, you mean us? You're asking us. And it's kind of like, it's implied that, we're not really going to save you. I mean, we're just going to steal everything and take all the money and just leave. Except later it becomes clear that you can't actually leave because there's like no provisions in the narrative for leaving. So you get this like this is something that doesn't come up a lot in these discussions. The idea that the players will start to do things that are wildly inappropriate or just maddening and crazy, like lighting sheep on fire and marching them into town or something like that, or getting in fights at the end because they know you're going to lurch them to the next plot point anyway. And this is the dark side of the Mercer effect, because no offense to any of you guys who enjoy watching these, but often I'm kind of annoyed where it's often presented that these are a bunch of obnoxious assholes who are doing terrible things, often very entertainingly, nothing against the actors. They're very entertaining, and they just fail upwards because the story requires heroes, and so they're the heroes, so they just fall into it. Mm-hmm. And that's the big ludonarrative dissonance that kind of annoys me, where, these characters aren't going to die. We need them for episode 2, so they're not going to die. So you're not waiting for that to happen. That's dissonance. If you want to have harmony in your games, you're going to have to do something you're not going to like, which is put the hammer down.
Yeah. Maybe forgive me because I might change gears here for a second. This was one of my topics, and I had a slightly different read on what I was getting at. Although I think it is about ludonarrative dissonance. We have talked a lot about the Mercer effect in the past. The thing that inspired this topic for me was it was really the dawn of the D20 open source license, open gaming license, right? Where you saw Dungeons and Dragons in 3rd edition said, hey, we're going to let these rules, they liked the idea that these rules could be flexible enough that they could inspire all tabletop gaming. Like, we did it so right that everyone can use some core feature of these rules in their own genre setting and the own game.
If I may interject, like, I was at Ground Zero where they had Ryan Dancy as a guest speaker at the Game Manufacturers Association. You know, and he was saying, like, literally saying there should be fewer games out there. There's too many games, and it just dilutes the marketplace and makes things harder, with the unspoken narrative being, really, everyone should just do D20.
Yeah, you should all be playing our game, but we understand that not everybody likes orcs and dwarves. So why don't you play space orcs and space dwarves instead?
Dungeons in space, yes.
But the huge thing where he's up there saying, yeah, I mean, there should only be one. By the way, we here, you know, at Wizards of the Coast aren't going to make those. We're only going to make Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, sure, people want Top Secret Star Frontiers, but we're not our Gamma World. But we won't make those. You guys can make those. We're just going to keep making D&D. Although they did make D20 Call of Cthulhu, which is another story.
And D20 Modern.
Oh, yes. Good old D20 Modern.
And Kingdoms of Calamar, which is hilarious.
And I'm sure the underlying market drive to this endeavor was this idea that, like, well, if people who weren't playing D&D learn the basic rules to D&D, then they're more likely to come play in D&D when they find out that dwarves are better than, you know, aliens or whatever it is. But I did play in a lot of these D20 games. I played Spycraft, which was like the D20 Modern, where you're all playing spies.
Alderax Fork, yeah.
Right. I think maybe it was Alderac also Alternity. I still have Alternity on my
No, Alderac is Legend of the Five Rings.
Yeah.
Right. And there was Oriental Adventures, right? Was kind of that too.
Yeah, well, Five Rings was Alderac got rich making Five Rings, but they were technically licensing it. Spycraft was their own internal IP. Alderac mostly makes board games now.
Yeah.
I think they make L5R again, but they license it from Wizards. It's complicated.
It is, and I always confuse them with Avalon, right? But yes. So that's the thing that, and this got me thinking as I look back at all of these games, and actually I don't even have to look back because the same thing is happening with 5th edition D&D. I think we're kind of in a resurgence of the hobby, largely because of the success of 5th edition D&D. And you can see that there are a lot of games out there that use the 5e course rules, but tweak it. I know personally of two. One is Esper Genesis, which is space. It's space. It's Mass Effect, D&D in space. And then also Gene Funk, which is like the latest cyberpunk 5e rule set. And the thing that always struck me as weird about these things, as it did back during 3rd edition games, is that when you look at it, you find that there's a lot of weird mismatches in the genre. I think the easiest one to point to is the fact that every one of these games has magic spells, even though they will call them, you know, computer hacks, or they'll call them like psychic powers. But every single one of these games has to have magic spells because D&D pretty much like 60 to 80% of the like mechanical game power effects are codified in their spell section. And so these games, even in settings where magic does not exist, needs to have some sort of analogous thing for spells, right? So I guess my question is to the group, why, like, is it important for a game's mechanics to be inspired by like the genre or the type of setting that it's trying to express through those mechanics?
Yes.
These games,
yes,
yeah, okay.
Yeah,
I will give you an example.
I'm
I'm going to give you an example of what happened after the OGL first wave of OGL when went away with PlayStation 4th edition. A lot of the companies that survived and are still thriving today, like your Green Ronins, like all those companies, they took their core games and they said, okay, we're going to make a second or third edition that deviates sometimes wildly from the D20 roots, because it never really was working D20 in the first place. D20 was designed for Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay, I got to stop and challenge you right there. Can you name a D20 game that strongly deviates from the D20 design?
No. I mean,
which
the
way?
second editions, they basically they dumped most of the D20 rules and they made their own rules. What was the one that it's like steampunk? It's there's a couple of, like, all the Green Ronin games afterwards. Green Ronin basically dumped all the D20 stuff and they went with Age system and they made the other thing.
Well, there's the Blue Rose system, which is a certain fork of D20. Yeah. And that's that has got problems, but yeah.
So basically, they almost all of them dumped their D20 roots in OGL and went with their own redesign in second or third editions, because they were going with D20 because it was, linked to Dungeons and Dragons, and they wanted to ride the coattails of Dungeons and Dragons. That was the attraction, right?
D20 was huge at the time. Everyone was making. I mean, White Wolf made a D20 game.
Yeah. But it also swamped the market as well with all the D20 stuff. I mean, I remember going to any game shop and it was like a huge wall of OGL and then D&D and then your tiny little sliver of whatever was left from 5 years ago, whatever. But now it's kind of different. Although we're seeing a resurgence with 5e.
I mean, I gotta stop right there and say, is it? Because I go to the gaming store and I see there's a huge wall of D&D stuff. There's a huge wall of Pathfinder, which is D&D.
Now. And
then I see a bunch of Scarred Land stuff. So, and then maybe there might be a copy of Fate or two.
Yeah, I mean that's what happened now. But I'm talking about 20 years ago, close to 20 years ago.
Well, 20 years ago it would have been but 20 years ago it would have been wall to wall D&D stuff as well as D20 stuff, and maybe you might see a Warhammer game there. But no, Dungeons & Dragons has always dominated.
Oh yeah. I mean, but I'm talking about
Vampire stuff. I gotta give Vampire credit.
Yeah. And so, if, for example, same thing happens with something like Savage Worlds. If you look at Savage Worlds and you look at their derivatives, once you start reading the books, you realize that they add a lot of stuff that simply is not in the core Savage World book, because in order to make it feel weird, cowboys with magic, you have to add a lot of stuff. If you want to make it that you're playing a superhero game, so playing the villains, you have to add a lot of stuff, right? You have to go with theme. Right. What is your theme? What's your idea? And go from there. I think PBTA, I think, is one of the exceptions.
I kind of want to back up here a little bit and say that one of the issues with ludonarrative harmony is that your rules that you present to players have to work with the kind of story that you want to tell. We just did a stream on retconning, which I brought up that often GMs will have to come up with some excuse. Like I've said, many times, you can't run a murder mystery in D&D because they can just raise the guy from the dead, and that's just the first spell I'm talking about. There's numerous other spells that you could use to find other stuff out. Like I've been pointing out, Speak with Dead will actually tell you who killed them, because Speak with Dead speaks with the imprint on the corpse, not the soul, and thus has privy information that the corpse wouldn't, that the person wouldn't know. But moving on. I don't believe, I've worked on many different designs, and I don't believe there's such thing as a generic rule system, because so you'll get Fate or PBTA or Savage Worlds showing up and saying, this is a generic system that you can play for any genre. But one of the problems you run into is the mere rules that are there are going to invoke certain things. D20 has hit points, and you start with a small quantity, and as you level up, you get a large quantity. And so as the game goes on, you become more and more bullet resistant. Things that would have killed you earlier don't kill you later. And that changes the way you look at the game. It'd be different if you were playing, say, World of Darkness. If you're playing World of Darkness, the 2003 edition, bullets can't kill you at all. Shadowrun has a problem where bullet damage is incredibly nerfed. You'll play that game differently than you would play a game like, say, Top Secret, or before Red cuts me off, Spycraft, which had a different damage system, or even like early version of D20 Star Wars, which is where Spycraft got its damage system from, which didn't raise your hit points you had like a wound in a vitality system, but your vitality never went up, and it was easy to get a critical hit that just wiped out your vitality and one-shotted you. And you'll play a game differently if you can be one-shotted. This is a huge, huge problem with anime role-playing games. Almost every anime role-playing game out there sucks. It is terrible and garbage. Because games like Battletech, feel free to tell me Battletech's not an anime game, will kill you in one hit. Or games like Mechton would have a damage system that kills you in one hit. But if you watch an anime, the characters are like dodging 30 or 40 missiles and fratricizing them and lasering them out of the air, doing all this awesome stuff. Then you get to the game and you can't do any of that.
Now, I think this might be the time to tell you about the thing that's been sticking in my mind. The game that puts in the absolute most legwork possible to try to differentiate itself without actually changing anything at the core, and that is the abomination that is Naruto D20. So, you guys at least know what Naruto is. What is Naruto about?
It's about ninjas. That was easy.
Wrong, it's about training. We have entire 3/4 of the book set up about how to train. And that is the game it sets up.
Well, see, at least they're being like okay.
At least they're being honest about the genre and themes. And what I do note about it that is interesting is that they will add something new to try to replicate what they've seen, to try to put that in and try to replicate the genre they're trying to imitate, which is specifically this one show. But they don't change the underlying systems.
Well,
it's still D20 modern down at the deep bottom of it.
It's an interesting.
And we still end up with those things.
Now
so
I want to play this.
It's fascinating to look at. Oh gosh, I have attempted so much to touch this, but it's so impenetrable. It's
that's the problem. Is I mean, like I will like it's been 0 days since Rafferty has bashed on Fate. Because like everyone tells me, oh, Fate's a generic game system and has aspects that let you change the story. Well, that sounds great. Here's 400 pages. Why is it that big? And buried in those rules is going to be what Fate thinks magic is, what Fate thinks cyberware is. It's going to be what, their specific, like this is one of the huge problems you run into these games. They have their own specific interpretations. Dungeons and Dragons, like D20's magic system of memorize a spell and then fire and forget it, and spells always work and never backfire, is a good system, but it's not the same system, as some other genres. It's not the same as the magic goes away. It's not the same as with a single spell. The Orth series, it's not the same as some other genres or stories of magic. And one huge problem you run into with these books is they don't spend a lot of time making their mission statement of what they're supposed to be.
Right. Often they're just trying to directly emulate rather than try to go for the feel, I think.
I wouldn't even say that. I would say like they're making a D20 game. Often they're making the D20. They want to be a D20 game. They don't want to be a genre. Because I've had you folks even in the stream have argued this with me, that people are playing Dungeons and Dragons, which is its own genre. And when people come to a D20 game, they expect it to be like Dungeons and Dragons. This is why like D20 Modern and Starfinder devote all the space to how to put dwarves, elves, and skeletons and orcs in your game. Which is like, I wanted to play D20 Modern because I didn't want orcs. Why would you devote several pages of the books to orcs? It's weird, and it's this thing of I mean, to be more positive about this, I don't know. I kind of want to talk about my games because I know that when we design,
we're not stopping you from talking about your games. Talk about your games. What do you do to enforce genre?
Our games are enforcing genre. Well, Urban Jungle was the big one. So Urban Jungle came back from the playtest, and the players were complaining that bullets killed people. And it's like, I like to say it that way because it's like, wait, see, what they were complaining about was that if one person came out and held you at gunpoint, there was very good odds that they could shoot you and down you or kill you instantly with a single shot. And players were upset by this. Now, in terms of genre, if you're playing a noir-style game, like Philip Marlowe, Sam Spade and that kind of stuff, when the bad guys pull out a gun and say, all right, reach for it, I'm getting out of here, no one stop me, and point a gun at them, you would expect in ludonarrative harmony for the players to say, I would like to not get shot today.
Right.
Maybe I'll have to come up with something to distract him or follow him where he goes, or maybe I'm the kind of character who's optimized who can get close to him and disarm him. But I am in fear that I will take a mortal wound from this. Whereas if you try to do that in Shadowrun, when the guy pulled out his gun and say, "Oh, you stand back," your players would already be shouting to roll initiative.
Yeah. I mean, in a Philip Marlowe movie or something like that, one person with a gun can stop an entire room full of people because nobody wants to be the person that takes a shot. So,
well, you
like this, yeah.
Or ludonarrative, like this is one of the big changes in the 2003 version of World of Darkness. Holding someone at gunpoint doesn't scare them because guns do 1, maybe 2 points of damage, and players have 7 hit points. So if someone was holding me at gunpoint, I still know I could cross the room and grapple them and disarm them before I ran out of hit points. And that's just me. There's probably 4 of us. Whereas in Chronicles of Darkness, the sequel, they not only did they raise bullet damage, they also added a fear rule, which I really appreciate, where if you got shot, it might not down you, but you might lose your nerve and have to flee the scene, which wouldn't be exactly the same, but it has the proper narrative effect. If one normal person holds another normal person at gunpoint, and you can play normal people in Chronicles of Darkness, one of my favorite games to do that in. Now you have ludonarrative harmony. If you get shot, it takes you out. Either you flee or you're dead. One of those, you can shoot people and make them run. And it's not as... We're not doing that retconning thing I was just complaining about. It's got ludonarrative harmony there. And that also came up during Urban Jungle. We had to rewrite the rules to make guns slightly less deadly and add abilities for players. One thing we didn't do was add more hit points. Players would think, well, if you just added more hit points, we'd have the tanking problem I just mentioned in World of Darkness. Instead, we added new rules that some characters can shrug it off if you're hard-boiled, but sidekick-type characters like your femme fatales and your spunky youth or whatever could shrug it off, but they would immediately suffer a fear effect. And if there were any other protective characters around, they would actually get a buff. So it could be that little Jimmy goes for the gun, gets shot, and then the hard-boiled guy clobbers him over the head, says, how can you shoot little Jimmy? And that is ludonarrative harmony. And we were able to do that in the rules. Because once again, an amateur designer would have just raised the hit points and be done.
Yeah. Probably.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's good because everyone is now playing their part within the expected parameters of the story they're trying to tell. Like people will often talk about like tabletop role-playing games or like where you have like this narrative and story or something, but they don't really pin it down to anything, right? It just ends up being like the improv that we're doing rather than just like we're trying to be a type of thing.
I don't think people understand genre, but go ahead.
That is very true.
I don't think they do, and I think that on multiple levels. Like, I don't think people understand genre from a narrative perspective, but I also think they don't understand that like genre can be expressed through mechanics. Like, I think the ultimate conceit behind the D20 or the open game license thing is this idea that like, well, we've created a system that you could apply to any kind of game that people would want to play. That supposes that people all want to play high adventure pulp action games, even if you cut the fantasy aspect out of it. And I think there's a lot of settings, like I think Star Wars is a setting that works that way. I'm going to think of all the Lucas properties, so Indiana Jones also. There's a lot of different genres of storytelling that all fall back on handful of quirky characters with good combat ability fighting supernatural forces or forces that greatly overpower them, right? And that's kind of where it comes from. But the reality is when you break this stuff down, for as many games as are trying to go for that, there are way many more that I think are very ill-suited for it. Like, and I was building to a point and I lost my point.
Well, I mean, related to your commentary, like one thing people forget about is that rules can invoke a kind of complexity or game balance. Like a lot of people will complain that Dungeons and Dragons wizards seem cooler than fighters. And one thing you've got in D&D is you've got stickiness. There's supposed to be the theory that if two people get next to each other, if one of them breaks away, the other one gets a free chance to hit them.
Mhm.
And one of the problems you'll run into is that you'll get some people who want to do Dungeons and Dragons as theater of the mind. We don't want to have a map because, maps and stuff. D&D is not a combat game. It's not about killing things, says the person playing it.
But then as soon as you take away the map, there's now no front line, and someone just says, well, the enemy just walks around you and goes to the wizard. It's like, well, how?
Like if you noticed, in Ironclaw, spells are usually described. I mean, some of them are explosions, but a lot of them are described as a group of people. Like pick a bunch of people that are all together, and then we define that later. Whereas Dungeons and Dragons will be like, this is a 180-degree semicircle with a 15-foot radius. So get out your protractors so we can properly do a burning hands today. And like you can do that with Theater of the Mind, but now we're going. I guess it gets 2 guys, maybe 3. And it's like speaking of ludonarrative harmony, if your game is supposed to be loosey-goosey described, in fast and loose terms, we shouldn't have attacks with that precise of an area, especially this divergence of where each one of them is different. This one's a cone. Do cones go up vertically? He's off the ground. Do I have to measure that? How high off the ground is he? Like, I can never get over that kind of stuff that's in those games. Whereas,
it doesn't matter if you shift to the Theater of the Mind if all the terms are not set up for that.
Exactly.
Right. And it's if D&D is supposed to be a game that's Theater of the Mind, why do we measure our 30-foot movement this precisely? So, like you could see the change in our games where Ironclaw is incredibly precise movement because I like miniatures games. But Urban Jungle, which was not a combat game, it's supposed to be, action sequences do happen, but we kept the movement a lot more vague in the game to describe it, as people moving from vague area to area, because that's what we expected people would want to do with it. I think one of the huge reasons why Powered by the Apocalypse and Blades in the Dark have taken off is because each one of them is bespoke crafted to be a specific thing that they want to be today. Like Dungeon World wants to be a very abstract dungeon crawl. Masks wants to be a Teen Titans, New Mutant style experience. So they only include the rules that are relevant to specifically what they want to do. And if it's not something related with it, they leave it out. So they don't have the problem that bloated games like Fate or Dungeons and Dragons have, which are full of all these rules, but you're supposed to ignore the ones that don't work.
What a revelation. I mean, I see your point there about the the gritty tactical rules and what you're getting at. I think that another way you could use the same example to prove a similar but different point is that those that's not a universal system either. You port it over to a system that has like modern guns and weapons, and all of a sudden the ranges fall apart, right? If the game expects you to use a 5-foot gridded battle map,
famously, D&D made a lot of hay about having 2 pages worth of guns rules, and it's the dumbest thing I've ever seen because they're less effective than bows.
Right. I mean, you don't get me started on that, but just to say, like, in your modern spy thriller, or your modern like war game, you're talking about ranges that are so ridiculously out of the scope and scale of your D&D ranges that like it would make no sense to try to model that on a map. Or, I mean, you would cram it in and then you'd be wondering why, like, wow, literally anyone can hit anybody because these guns are designed to shoot up to ranges of several hundreds of feet and everyone is packing one of them. So yeah.
Yeah, realistic, like you'll hear a lot of hay from people saying, most urban fights are only from 10 feet away in an alleyway. It's like, yeah, we're carrying military-grade gear, guys.
Right.
The big
we can't outrun a bullet anyway. So
yeah, the big ludonarrative dissonance I always have is with cyberpunk games, and especially like Shadowrun. Like I've complained before that these games do not devote enough attention to the concept of low profile. That the idea Shadowrunner, you run in the shadows, in the name. That you're literally Shadowrun was they took their pre-beta Earth Dawn game. They took a fantasy game. And at the last minute added cyberpunk stuff. Because you get Shadowrun First Edition, half the illustrations in it and some of the text is copied and pasted from a generic fantasy game. It was just the last minute they said, what if we put guns in this? And boom, it was huge. And that's why everyone after that said, what if we had guns in D&D? But it has that, it's also not written with crime in mind. Like you're supposed to be kind of mercenaries, but you never really get arrested. You can just order rocket launchers in the mail. So most of the games just evolved into huge firefights in public, which, once again, hey, if you're having fun. But if you came to Shadowrun after reading all of the intro text in the book that says, oh, you're running with the shadows. So, I mean, I would think a game like The Sprawl does it a little bit better because, well, it's powered by the Apocalypse, and those tend to like dial you down a few notches. But it's some better discussion about it. I don't know. I'm probably filled with a lot more negative examples. Can you guys think of more examples where you think the rules work very well with narrative?
I mean, you mentioned, I think earlier, at least 2 Star Wars, and people want to say otherwise. I felt when I was playing it, so this is also a matter of feel. The original Star Wars D6 felt very much as a niche application of that first generation of Star Wars, right? But if you take that D6 story and you put it in any other era, more modern Star Wars, it doesn't work because one of the things about the original D6 Star Wars was that Jedi were incredibly rare and incredibly powerful compared to everyone else. And so, if somebody says I use the Force, like, okay, we gotta run, right? Because our blasters are not gonna do anything, whatever. But if you're playing your scoundrels, your rebels, your stormtroopers, it worked very well for that.
Yeah,
but it didn't transfer.
That's funny that you bring that up because I never understand it. What do you mean Jedi are powerful? Jedi are wimps.
I mean, no, they have powers that no one else can have, and
yeah, but they're wimps. I mean, in the Revenge of the Sith movie, they all just die. A bunch of stormtroopers just shoot them.
Well, it depends on your interpretation because there's also like an animated short where one Jedi takes an entire army of robots and just destroys them, right?
What about when the genre constantly changes?
Right,
exactly,
but also this is why I say a misunderstanding of genre. It's like saying, well, yeah, but that's like saying in D&D, wizards are amazing. Look at Elminster. It's like Elminster is an epic level wizard. You start the game as a guy with a D6 with 6 hit points and 1 spell a day. So it could just be that Mace Windu is a high level Jedi. But you have this kind of power creep coming into it where, well, if Mace Windu kicks ass, obviously all Jedi kick ass, except it's clearly demonstrated that Shaggy does not kick ass.
But I'm talking about the original D6 because then
Clone Wars.
Later on, when you have the D20 version of Star Wars, that fit.
Well, the D20 version that came out started the mission. Well, you had that mission creep and that dark what is it? The Lance Starkiller or whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, that one is Force Unleashed.
Right, Force Unleashed. You started to have that mission creep in here of where we're pulling spaceships out of the air with the power of our minds. And they were just giving that to everybody. And like I said, that's another... This actually gets to another thing about ludonarrative dissonance. I've complained in the past that if your players want to pull starships out of the sky or be kick-ass heroes, why do so many games start you off as a scrub? Like, nobody... I've had this numerous occasions. People don't know anything about D&D. And I ask them, what do they want to do? And they say, I want to throw a fireball. And instantly, you should punch everyone in the face who says, you can't throw a fireball at first level. You have to play 10 or more sessions of this game before we'll let you throw fireballs. It's like, what bullshit is that? And that's what I mean by, like some people want to show up at the game and already be empowered. But the game is like, there's this running theme in RPGs that you start as a scrub. And like a lot of people wanted to be super powerful Jedis. So why aren't you letting them be Jedis? It's Star Wars. It's Star Wars. People want to be cool. Why would we hate cool?
Right. I think maybe the Fantasy Flight games maybe do that better than like the D20 one for sure, because you will start as a scrub in a D20 game. In terms of positive things, if I were to name something that does something positive in terms of ludonarrative harmony, it would probably be with the Warhammer Fantasy role-playing games and the way it presents things like magic, where it outright states magic is unstable, unreliable, and can cause terrible forces. and it sets up rules for that, so that half the time when you try to do something more complicated than turn on a light, you're risking doing something bad. And
Oh,
initially, the bad things might be very minor, like your cousin stubs their toe or you curdle a bunch of milk around you, but later on, it can just directly mutate you and turn you to a monster immediately.
or
Yeah.
kill you instantly. Warhammer second, like Warhammer, I'm a big fan of 1, 2. I haven't seen 3 or 4. 2 had one of my favorite things in it that builds narrative, which is one of the fumble results on the wizard table is dark magic. You have learned dark magic. It's an extra magic die all the time. You're welcome. You just know how to do this now. And it's like, okay, but you read the fine print on it, so you roll an extra die, but you have to throw out your lowest die. So you roll like
You
3
get
dice.
power and you get it as a cost. It's great.
Right. Well, but I mean, it still sounds better because I roll 3 dice, but throw out the lowest one. That still sounds better. But all of the dice count for
Rolling doubles.
fumbles for the bad effects.
Yeah.
And now you've gone from 2 to 3, which means you've unlocked triple bad effects. And
Which
so
are the worst ones.
But that's genre enforcing because it's like, hey, the more I cast spells, the more powerful I get, which is also the more you can blow stuff up. That's ludonarrative harmony.
You have to ask, am I going to stand adjacent to the wizard who could explode now? No, I don't trust them. I'm going to be over here.
Right, and that's ludonarrative harmony as compared to another game that's a lot like it, which is Rollmaster. Rollmaster also had you rolling dice, and the more powerful the spell was, the more it could blow up. But in Warhammer, the explosions are proportional to the force. You have to be rolling 2 dice to get on the 2 dice fumble table, and you have to be rolling 3 dice to get on the 3 dice fumble table. So if you're just rolling 1 die and casting petty spells, or you're a first level scrub, the worst you can do is slowly go crazy. You can't blow yourself up or unleash a portal that sucks everything into it until you're at the higher levels. Whereas in a game like Rollmaster just has open-ended rolling. This is why Hackmaster makes fun of it. Your very first spell you cast in Hackmaster, you could fumble and fall into a coma for 2 months or blow up your skull because it's just random what happens to you. That's ludonarrative dissonance because I show up at the table, I took 2 hours to make my character because it's fucking Rollmaster. Very first spell I cast puts me in a coma. It's like,
I swear I had a game just like that, but I can't remember what the system was. Dang, man.
Dragon Age?
No, Dragon Age, I
No.
had lived long enough to fail at becoming a Grey Knight.
Okay. Because Dragon Age also has a fumble in it that's not proportional to the magic you get.
I actually did like Dragon Age, and when I played it, it felt when it started because it did suffer from this bloat later on where they added more levels.
It's pretty good.
And once they added like levels 15 to 20, whatever, it's like, oh, I can be this hugely powerful character. But the basic Dragon Age felt like playing Dragon Age Origins, right? That you could be pretty strong, but a good strike or a good fireball, whatever, could just going to take you down no matter what, right?
Now I want to pick on Red. Red, tell us how great Forbidden Lands is.
I love Forbidden Lands. What are we talking about?
We're talking about ludonarrative harmony. Why do you like Forbidden Lands? It's exactly the same as D&D.
But it's not, though. It's exactly the same as D&D purports to be.
What rules changes does Forbidden Lands have that immerse you in the setting?
So, for me, and I'm on record on this podcast as complaining that I think that there is something inherently fun and dramatic about the idea of a group of smelly, outdoorsy campers creeping into dark underground cave systems that are full of horrible gibbering mouthers. I think that alone generates a really cool emergent story, right? I think that's the promise that Dungeons and Dragons was built on. I don't know why I feel this way. It could be because the title is Dungeons and Dragons. It's literally big monsters in scary dark places.
There's a couple things. One problem with a lot of old school games is that they often just want to kill you instantly and randomly. Like, hey, it's like, I need to climb down this, you need to climb down, make a climbing roll. Did you fail it? You fall to your death. And the problem with those is because it's random and uncertain. It's no fun because you just throw yourself at it and like, okay, guys, I died. I guess I sit here and do nothing for the next 2 hours while you guys play the adventure.
My favorite meme is the Shadowgate the Shadowgate ending with the Grim Reaper, and it just says, "So sad your adventures had to end here." And it's like, I opened a door and you blew me up. Like, that's not sad. That's mean. You're an asshole.
Right. Whereas Forbidden Lands has this thing going on where if you fail a skill roll, you can push it, which will possibly injure you or inconvenience you later. But
Yes.
You still get that extra boost.
Yes,
and the other nice thing that Forbidden Lands is doing is tracking resources. I've complained about this. Players don't want to do that anymore. A lot of D&D was oriented around fatigue, like wearing you down. Fighters can fight all day, but wizards might take days or weeks to recharge their spells. So you wanted to pick your battles. You wanted to wander around the wilderness in a timely manner. You didn't want to fuck around with random monsters because healing was slow. And then when you got to the dungeon, you didn't want to spend a lot of time here because things would show up and eat your henchmen. You want to get in and get out before staying here too long and other bandits or monsters show up. So you want to work fast and get in and get out. And D&D over time deleted all of those rules because people weren't using them or understood them, and you don't get that experience. Whereas in Forbidden Lands, your food is constantly running out, your water is constantly running out, and they've reduced those numbers and overhead to make it feel more immersive. It's every time you eat, you randomly roll to see if you're out of rations. And when you drink, you randomly roll to see your water. So you have some, but not a lot, but you can't depend on it. And it's balancing all of those that make you feel like you're in a desperate wilderness, unlike, say, Dungeons & Dragons, where you never feel like that.
No, it's very true. The mechanics maximize the opportunities for you to make difficult decisions that will ultimately affect how the game is going to go, which is something that a lot of people don't really enjoy. So I get that. But I think the other thing, too, is that when we play Forbidden Lands and my character dies because he's exhausted and dehydrated and he falls into a quicksand pit, that's delightful. And you try to explain that to a D&D player who's like, my character slayed the red dragon and your character died in a quicksand. How is that fun? And it's like, well, because my character died in the quicksand as a result of many small decisions and or mistakes that I made that led to that point. And your character slayed the dragon because your DM decided that that's how you were going to end your campaign. Like, there's very little that you could have done that was going to derail you from slaying the red dragon.
Right.
Ultimately.
And before we, one problem is I don't want to emphasize, I'm leery of these conversations where it's like, your games where you're a high-powered Jedi and Elminster are no fun. You should play a game where you're a dirt scrub who dies in the wilderness of starvation. There are games, I think, that empower players that also do that. Like, a big one is we really should give a shout-out to Vampire, which, as much as I make fun of it, the rules do really get you into what they want. They want you to be part of a clan. Your clan unlocks certain specific clan-related powers for you. Your history and your relationship with the clan is important to the game. And they do a really good job of sculpting your character to be this specific kind of vampire. You walk out of the character creation process of Vampire with the kind of character they want you to play immediately. And also, your vampires are awesome. You start off with a cool set of powers and a fair amount of skills, and you start off empowered, you only go up from there.
Yeah, it's very difficult in that game to make a character that cannot do something.
I mean, you get something. You get potence, you get celerity, you get something. Mm-hmm. Some people will max it out and abuse it, and that's a different issue, but you will show up with the ability to grab people and suck blood out of them. And there's not a fumble system in the game. It's only like if you have no dice at all. They're very specific that drinking blood. I mean, I criticize them for this, but the drinking blood part is not what the game is about. It's about the courtly intrigue. And the other game, of course, if I can toot my own horn, is we made the Far-Flung role-playing game, which was where we wanted people to be Time Lords and cosmic beings. And so we started with Powered by the Apocalypse, a game notorious for making everybody scrubs who die of starvation, and elevated everyone to super-powered amazeballs. And then wrote a game around that was, if you're all super-powered amazeballs, then we can't be constantly threatening to kill you. We can make you sad. We can destroy stuff you care about. The clock can run out and windows of opportunity can go away. You can track relationships with other people. All things, but not doing this thing that a lot of other RPGs do, which is trying to constantly threaten to kill you. That's an empty threat in most games, and especially in an Immortal game.
Now, I want to pull this game because it's one of my favorite, if not my favorite, superhero game ever, because I felt like really did it well. Marvel Saga. Too bad nobody's actually making a revival of that one.
That's the card game one.
Yeah, that's the card game one. And the reason why it is because it's card game, and you have everybody has a deck, and you try to pair your card with whatever ability you're strongest at, while keeping the other ones for defense or whatever. It gives you that sense of like a good superhero fight. It's a tactical fight, but not in the I move here and do this, but rather it's like I have this ability and my buddy has rays and that guy's from ice, so I'm going to counter that, right? And those fights became very interesting because it's about the power set and how you play around and throw cards and stuff like that. And that, I think Marvel Saga did very well without having many of the derailing things like, oh, everybody can shoot rays and then this guy can, control time. Absolutely. And well, we're done.
Yeah, and as much as I like Marvel Saga, I mean, I would agree with you in the surface. The problem was you had these cards that had very specific pictures on them and very specific things that were taken from the comic books and that kind of thing. And I think on the one hand, in theory, the Saga game was empowering you to do whatever you wanted. In practice, the players looked at the cards and saw very specific things happening on the cards. And they assumed because of the flavor text and the way it looked, they were only allowed to do this thing.
Now, I think that would a new edition would have probably cleared up that rule.
I think I've seen more attempts to make card-based games. I think it could have been good. I think one of the things that's really cool about Powered by the Apocalypse games and Blades in the Dark is they put a little one line on there that says what this ability is. Like you can sneak around, or you can, or you can stab people in secret. And the mere act of looking at your character sheet reinforces who you are and what you do. And I want to give a shout out to one of the things that disappeared from D20. In the Forgotten Realms D20 books, they used to have all these cool little feats that they would start you off in the game called stuff like Blooded or Clear-Headed or Righteous or Mercantile. And they would be like 2 minor bonuses to something. Like a blooded person gets +1 to Fortitude and +2 to Initiative. That's it. But because it came with flavor text on there where it said blooded, you are no stranger to battle. Rah! Because it said that and had a mechanical advantage, it was always funny in the game when it came up of like, I need to make a Fortitude saving throw. Okay, well, you need a 21. I rolled exactly 21. Haha, I am blooded and tempered in battle. People would bring up that they had those line items on their character sheets that helped define who they were. And I always thought that was awesome. And the game has really gotten away from that, where like nowadays feats are incredibly abstract.
I feel like my experience has always been kind of like a little bit polar opposite to that, though. I think they usually call those traits, and every time they seem to be taken, like I feel like they only exist on the game side, but without the narrative. People will take it because, like, well, I wanted the +2 initiative. It says I'm quick. This is not really part of my character, but I have +2 on initiative now.
Well, yeah, but I noticed
it became throwaway at some point.
But gamers
the idea is great, though. I do agree.
Yeah, gamers gonna. I mean, I noticed some players would do that. I mean, like there was one D20 homebrew I was in that eventually became Bleeding Edge. But we set up that game where you could get a bunch of stat bonuses and skill bonuses that were paired with the descriptors. And one of the players just went through and picked all the ones that made him a stubborn asshole. If there were any feats in the game that made him more of a stubborn asshole, he picked them. And what was funny was that gave him like the biggest persuasion roll in the entire party, because all of them had bonuses to you never give up, or you're bombastic, you're always loud, and all of those stacked in this huge persuasion bonus that if he ever needed to tell anybody to do anything, they did it. And to me, that felt a little more organic than what you see in other games, because you may have noticed like D&D got rid of skill ranks. Like D&D 3rd edition and Pathfinder 1st, you'd spend all your different points on different skills, whereas in later versions you either have it or you don't. And they started doing that because they just because they noticed that the fiddly bits, the abstraction of marks and points, attracts gamers, and casuals don't necessarily understand it. Whereas the big swaths of you are a fighter, you are athletic, you are stubborn, those big quality things are what people are looking for in terms of role playing. Those usually work a little bit better. But
Right,
like I
they're
said,
looking for like tangibles and incomparables kind of to add to their character.
right. I mean, I enjoy Iron Claw and games like that where we have all the careers listed side by side, and specifically they all stack. So when someone says I'm an otter thief, or otter burglar thief or whatever, and all of those dice are all stacked together, to me that feels more like role playing thing of I got these because I have these jobs, and not what a player would usually say, which is I have plus 15 to diplomacy, and not necessarily tell you where they got those from. They just have a plus 15 in diplomacy.
Right, a mechanic very devoid of that narrative that could be attached to it.
Yeah, I mean, no, I would say that one of the big things is numbers aren't bad, because often people will tell you we're role playing, not role playing. Numbers aren't bad, but the numbers should be coming. If the numbers come from somewhere, they
don't become magical numbers. Was like, well, I have this number, so I guess stuff happens, right?
Right, it's better that D&D 5 says a fighter is proficient in swords and adds their proficiency bonus to swords, rather than here's a base attack bonus and just add that abstractly. It feels a little bit better. I can say in plain English, a fighter is proficient with swords, and that doesn't sound very gamery.
I'll also point out something again that I think is interesting, because Iron Claw, this is going back to a conversation that might not even have been in this podcast, so I apologize, but Iron Claw is designed in such a way that I think you are encouraged to understand the whole system. Like, I would not expect any one person to know all of the individual powers and abilities of every class and subclass that is currently considered, default in 5th edition D&D. However, when we play Iron Claw, there's many cases where you just know, if this person is a merchant, or if they're like a ferryman or whatever, if they're a soldier, then they have these 3 skills, which means that they would, be proficient or have some advantage when dealing in those 3 skills. Like, it's cool. It's cool in that way that you really could sort of like, or even if you guessed, right? It makes enough sense that if you said, oh, this is a merchant, they probably have haggling. You could check the book and you'd be right. They'd have the haggling gift. So
well, that was one complaint I was having about the retconning thing, because I've been in games before where suddenly we confront the villains and they're like, like I said, Warforged fighters or whatever. They have a completely different skill set and ability set than what they should have been doing earlier that they pulled off. And that creates ludonarrative dissonance, because I'm going like, how did these guys do all of that? Are they 20th level and just happen to have multi-classed and all this stuff? Mm-hmm. Or was the GM just kind of hand-waving around that? I mean, to me, that's where ludonarrative dissonance comes in. If learning the rules should also tell us about the world. Like, it should be that, if we know wizardry is capable of doing this, but only certain schools can do this, or only certain people can do this, then we can narrow down who can actually do it. Whereas in a Dungeons & Dragons game, especially a fiat-driven game, where magic can do anything the GM says it does, there's no point in figuring anything out. If a weird magic thing happened, we could just say, well, it could have been a weird magic thing. So, I can't say it could only be someone of this, or it could be this specific person, or this was employed. It was just anything. And so that's why, I want to conclude all this by saying that's why ludonarrative harmony is important. If story happens separately from rules, then you'll get some people who are arguing everything in terms of story, the role players, not role players, and so on a story. And then when a rule thing starts to happen, we flip a switch in our heads, and now we're in rule land where, maybe it's a combat, which might kill us, but, because for some reason we can lose that. But we already know, story is always more important than rules. So this rule stuff doesn't really matter. I mean, it might be a combat, and let's face it, combat's not role playing, I tell you. So we already know this over here doesn't matter. Story and what the GM is trying to get at, how to read their mind actually matters. And then rules don't matter. And, that's why you see a huge problem where everyone says they're playing D&D, but everyone's doing a different homebrew. But D&D is easy to learn because you don't need to know the rules. You just show up and respond to what's going on. You don't need to know any rules.
Right.
Angry Rafferty, ending on a bad note.
All right. So what do you got to end off on lessons? What's your statement here?
I think there should be a little narrative. I want to go back to dissonance, but it isn't. Harmony should be the goal, right? Your rules enforce and encourage behavior. They should emulate, if nothing else, what you're trying to go for, right? If you want something that is, high heroic and all that, and people can just tank 100 arrows, and so be it. But if you want somebody who's squishy because, someone with a gun can just scare an entire room, then your rules have to work that way. Otherwise, you're going against the grain, and you're doing a disservice to yourself, to the game, and to your players. So there you go.
That's good. That's good. And what about you, Red?
Yeah, I basically will echo what Lessons said. I think there's a cool, a lot of people, we approach rules of these games as sort of like a necessary hurdle or as something that's just there to make it a game versus, a movie or just unstructured story time. But I think the rules have a lot of potential to express genre and express, a type of narrative. And that's why I always get a little bit sad when I'm looking through the pages of psychic powers that are really just spells, but are not called spells. Because I'm like, man, this game could have probably been a much more coherent, neater, better rule set if it was designed to the ends that it was trying to accomplish. But maybe those ends were always going to just be D&D, but with robot arms. I don't know.
Well, there you have it then. So I think that's going to be it for this episode of Notes from the Aleph. We stream episodes bi-weekly Fridays at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can join us live at Twitch at twitch.tv/Ractus. We also stream and record weekly tabletop games at the same channel, and you can come join us when we start at 10 a.m., 2 p.m., and 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Sundays and Wednesdays. Norman Rafferty here is a partner and writer for Sanguine Games. Check out sanguinegames.com and join us on the Reddit and Twitter, and look forward to the upcoming Book of Coral's Ironclaw expansion book. Be sure to check out RedRabbit over at startplaying.games as RedRabbit. And of course, be sure to check out Lessons Learned at Lessons Learned 1 on YouTube and Twitch, and check out all of his good content over there. And of course, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and come see us all again, everybody. Until next time.